This is Temple, the brand new Warframe, and believe me, this rock idol turns up the heat, quite literally. So, in today's guide, I'm gonna tell you everything about Temple, where to farm them, how their skills work, and of course, I have builds, even multiple of them. As always, big shoutouts to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on, and now, let's jump right into it. The first topic on our list today would be where you can get Temple for yourself, and this is relatively straightforward and similar to other recently released frames. First of all, you have to be done with the main storyline, which means you have to finish the Warframe 1999 quest because you need to have access to the Hex Syndicate. And speaking of the Hex, you need to be rank 4 with them, and then you can play the new stage defense mission that you can see right here, from which you get the main as well as the component blueprints. However, just like with other Warframes, there is a sort of pity system where if you get unlucky with the drops, there's also a new resource that you can get from this mission called Rot Heart Strings, and what you can do with them is go to Flair in the Helvania Mall and exchange them for the blueprints that you're still missing. Now, the temple that you see in this video was provided to me by Digital Extremes as part of the Warframe Creator Program, so a big thank you to DE for enabling me to bring you this video as early as possible. But now that you know how to get your greedy fingers on your own copy of Temple, let's talk about what they can actually do, starting out with the passive, which is relatively straightforward. Temple has a unique mechanic, which is this little metronome that you see under your crosshairs in the middle of the screen. This thing always swings from left to right, and when you cast an ability while it is in this area in the center, then that ability will only cost half the energy, and you will also get a stronger version of the skill. In which way stronger? We're going to talk about that as we go over every individual ability now. Skill number 1 goes by the name Pyrotechnics, and this is a relatively simple and straightforward one. At the point that you're currently aiming at, there will be a sort of invisible AoE in which flame pillars will shoot out of the ground and deal damage to nearby enemies. That is basically it, and if you cast it while the metronome is in the center, then you get even more pillars and therefore deal more damage. Very simple, very straightforward, and this also happens to be Temple's helmet ability. I don't think it's going to be all too great as a helmet subsume, but one little trick that I have here would be, if you want to level up and forma your Temple quick and easy, then what you can do is just mod a bit of ability strength onto them, and even though the damage from the first ability isn't all that amazing, it should be high enough to rack up a lot of kills in the Sanctuary Onslaught, therefore speed leveling your Temple. At least that's the way I did it, and it was very comfortable. Ability number 2 is called Overdrive, and this one is like Arcane Avenger on steroids. If you like crits, this is the ability for you. See, what it does is, it shoots out a sort of energy wave in a cone in front of you, and every enemy that gets hit by this energy wave gets a debuff where your crit chance against that enemy is significantly increased. You can see it on the ability card here, but the cool thing with this is, this crit chance is flat crit chance, like Arcane Avenger, and therefore very, very strong. And what makes it even better is that if you cast this while the metronome is in the center, this crit chance buff doubles, meaning it is very, very easy to just deal red crits on all affected enemies, which makes this ability incredibly strong. Okay, now, abilities 1 and 2 were relatively straightforward. Ability 3, however, Ripper's Wail, is a bit more complex, so let's go over it step by step. The first thing that it does is, once you cast it, the weapons of you and all allies in affinity range get a heat damage buff. This buff also scales with ability strength, and you can see the percentage in the top right corner of the screen. However, you can ramp up this heat damage percentage even higher, up to a maximum of a completely insane 750%, and the way you do this is, while this buff from your 3 is on, every time you cast your first or second ability while the metronome is in the center, this will extend the duration of your 3 up to a maximum of 60 seconds, and also every single time increase this heat damage buff by a little bit, as you can also see in the background right here. Now, the maximum duration of Ripper's Wail is 60 seconds. You cannot extend it anymore beyond that, but that shouldn't be too much of a problem. 60 seconds is more than enough. And another cool feature here is, when you initially cast this, you will become completely invincible for a short period of time, so you can also use this ability as a sort of panic button. However, I also have a tiny little criticism here, and that is that if you have increased the duration of the buff to the maximum of 60 seconds, and then you cast the third ability again because you need to heal or something, then it will reset the duration back to the initial value and you have to ramp it up again. It would be cool if they could make it that if the duration is already higher than the standard value, it would just retain the previous duration if you recast the skill. And last, but definitely not least, let's talk about the fourth ability, Temple's Exalted electric guitar by the name of Lizzie, and the fourth ability is called Exalted Solo. Here's how it works. First of all, as you might have noticed, whenever you cast an ability with the metronome in the center, you will charge this little bar in the middle of the screen. This is actually the energy for your Exalted guitar. Yes, that's right, unlike other Exalted weapons, this will not constantly drain your energy over time while it's out, but this little bar in the center of the screen. And while using the guitar, you can easily fill it up again by casting other abilities while the metronome is in the center. However, also the guitar itself is very interesting. First of all, it counts as a primary weapon and therefore uses primary weapon mods and arcanes, and it kind of works similar to the Ignis Wraith in that it is a flamethrower, or as I'm obliged to say, Flammenwerfer, but it not only valves Flammen, it also has the ability to do elemental priming. See, as soon as you enter aim mode, you will notice that your ability bar in the bottom right corner of the screen changes to a bar with 4 different elements. While you are zoomed in with your guitar, if you press the ability buttons 1 to 4, it will not cast an ability, it will instead shoot out a projectile of that respective element with your Exalted guitar. This, if you ask me, is a very cool feature, although I gotta say the projectiles are relatively small, so I don't think this has any great group priming capabilities, and I would rather use it to prime viral and corrosive on maybe a necromech or a single big enemy. And as always, if you could maybe drop a little like for the video, that would be super nice because it always helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm. Cheers so much for your support. But before we jump into the build section for Temple themselves, let's for a minute take a closer look at Lizzie, the Exalted guitar, and do a bit more of an analysis of what this weapon is capable of and how to mod it. First of all, and this is very important, since it is a flamethrower like the Ignis Wraith, it counts as a beam weapon, and the beam length is set to be 10 meters, although when I tested it, it was more like 15 meters. But regardless whether 10 or 15, once you see it in practice, you will notice that this is a whole bunch of nothing. When you want to play with Lizzie, you have to install an Exalted adapter and use Sinister Reach to increase your beam length to what I have tested to be around 25 meters of maximum range. Without beam length mod, this thing is a pain to play. Next, let's look at the damage stats, and these are actually super duper impressive. We have very good crit performance with 35% crit chance on the normal fire with a 2.3x multiplier. This is very good. Plus, also 35% status chance, which, chef's kiss, and a ginormous base damage of 316.6 pure heat damage. However, there is of course not only the primary fire, we also have the different 4 elemental secondary fires, and here the stats look not all that amazing. We have 15% crit chance, 2x multiplier, 25% status chance, and 372.5 damage. By the way, same figures for each and every one of those 4 elements. So from the testing that I personally did so far, I would say that those elemental secondary fires are mainly useful to maybe viral prime a single target, maybe use the magnetic one to rip away overguard from one single tanky enemy, but they don't really have AoE application, so in practice, I actually ended up not using them all too much. However, if you found a different use for them already, then let us know in the comments down below, would be curious to hear about that. But yeah, long story short, in my opinion, Lizzie is primarily meant to be used for the primary fire because of the massive damage, crit chance, crit multiplier, status chance, everything. Lizzie is amazing. So, how do I build her? First of all, one thing that is a must here would be Sinister Reach to increase your beam length. Then, because it has such high base values, we go for crit chance and crit damage, galvanized chamber for the multi-shot, galvanized aptitude for even more status chance and the base damage. And then what I did here is craft a blast build because we already have heat damage, so that is very easy to do. And that's why I added Rifle Elementalist as well as a Bane mod, Rhyme Rounds to add cold to turn the heat into blast, and finally Vile Acceleration for much more fire rate so we can blast out even more. As Primary Arcane, I actually went with Primary Crux this time. I think on Lizzie it's pretty darn good, although the ammo efficiency part unfortunately doesn't work. Alternatively, I would recommend just go for Primary Merciless to get even more base damage. This right here would be the full blast build, but if you don't want to go for blast, then you can also do a pure heat build where you do heat damage over time. Only thing that changes here is you swap the cold for even more heat. But if you don't want to go for damage over time, then you could also choose this build right here, which is basically a corrosive heat build meant to strip away enemy armor and deal flat damage instead of damage over time. And now that you know how to build Lizzie, let's finally also talk about how to build Temple themselves. And when it comes to the builds, I actually have two very different builds prepared for you. One is an Exalted build that focuses on playing with Lizzie and dealing as much damage as possible. It is really insane, you're gonna love it. And the other one is a bit more gimmicky, where I sort of shoehorn Temple into using their first ability and spamming that as hard as possible. Super duper fun to play, so let's jump right into it, starting out with the Exalted guitar build. Now, the first question is, how does this whole thing work, how to play it? And luckily, this is actually very simple. The first thing you do once you get into the mission is you cast your third ability to switch on the big heat damage buff. Then you try to spam your first and your second ability as much as possible while hitting the metronome just right to increase that heat damage buff from your third ability to the maximum of 750% as fast as possible. And from that point on, all you really need to do is summon Lizzie and start blasting at the enemy, combined with the occasional use of your second ability to get this crit chance bonus against the enemies, and also to make sure that Lizzie doesn't run out of ammo, try to cast it whenever the metronome is in the middle. If you're low on health, cast your third ability again, and that would already be it. So, long story short, what does this mean for your survivability? Well, in my humble opinion, it means that at base level Steel Path, you should be alright, but as soon as you go into deep Archimedia types of level ranges around the 400 to 500, you will probably need some additional damage reduction to not constantly have to recast this super long animation. So Mirage's Eclipse would be the first choice. The problem here is that the game counts your 3 as the same type of damage buffing ability that also Eclipse is, therefore you can't have them both on the frame at the same time, and that means you either have to sacrifice your third ability to actually go and use Eclipse, or maybe, although it is less convenient to play, go for Nova's Null Stars and get your damage reduction from that. Or what would also be a possibility would be Cydo9's invisibility skill. Doesn't make you more tanky, but if you're invisible, you don't really care all too much about it. But with all that being said, let's now check out the build, starting out with the Helmet ability, where if you want to go for the Exalted weapon, I actually think you don't need any Helmet ability whatsoever. But if you really want one, then the only plausible slot to put it in would be the first one in my opinion, because you need the 2 for the crit chance bonus, you need the 3 for the big heat damage bonus, and the 4 is obviously your Exalted weapon, so subsuming over the 1 is really the only option, and here you're free to basically use whatever you want. For the Archon shards, I went for 3 yellows into more casting speed to speed up the ability spamming a little bit. As for the other 2 slots, I would recommend either going for more ability strength, ability duration, whatever you like, or you could also go for green shards to get better corrosive armor stripping capabilities. As for the build itself, I went into a lot of power strength with growing power in the aura, power drift in the Exilus, blind rage, transient fortitude, and umbral intensify. Now, about umbral intensify, you might argue that Archon intensify would be better because we have an ability with which we can heal ourselves, so we could trigger Archon intensify and therefore get more ability strength out of it. But keep in mind, the additional ability strength from Archon intensify only lasts for 10 seconds, And trust me, you really don't want to be forced to use your 3 every freaking 10 seconds. You're gonna lose your mind. Please don't do that. Stick with Umbral Intensify. Then, for the energy, I went for Prime Flow as well as Equilibrium, and then Adaptation, Archon Vitality, and Arcane Guardian for the survivability, followed by, in the second Arcane slot, the brand new Arcane Hotshot, which is tailor-made for Temple, because what it does is, whenever you trigger a heat status effect with an ability, then you get plus 6% weapon crit chance, stacking up to 50 times, meaning this Arcane at maximum rank can get you up to plus 300% crit chance on your weapons, including your Exalted Guitar, and that is very wild. This right here then would be a screenshot of the full build, and when it comes to weapons or companions, you're pretty much free to use whatever you like. This build is compatible with everything, and you should definitely try it out because Lizzie is such a strong Exalted weapon, you're just gonna rip everything into pieces. But okay, so much for the Exalted weapon build, but let's now talk about a build that is a little bit more memey, let's say, but also pretty darn strong and very fun to play. Here's how it works. First of all, this build is focused on dealing the main portion of our damage with purely our first ability and not with weapons whatsoever. Therefore, what we do is the same thing that I previously did with many other frames already. We use Shade as a companion who keeps us constantly invisible as long as there are enemies nearby and you don't fire your weapons. But since we're just using abilities, we're not firing the weapons, so our invisibility will be up constantly. And then we replace our third ability, the heat damage bonus, with Rhino's Roar, because believe it or not, Rhino's Roar is simply much stronger with your first ability than the heat damage bonus itself. And from that point on, all we do is just spam our first ability over and over again until nothing in the room stands. Now, for the build, we also here go for a lot of ability strength, so R1 deals more damage. This right here then would be the full build. However, what's much more interesting here would be the build on my Shade that you can see right here. The important part here being, of course, Ghost and Guardian, so you can stay invisible, and Shade can also refresh your shield. But the very cool thing here would be Duplex Bond. See, even though you and also Shade themselves are not allowed to shoot weapons, otherwise your invisibility would be lost, the clones from Duplex Bond, they are actually going to attack the enemies, and this is not going to cost you your invisibility. And as far as I can tell from my testing, this allows you to use a very funny interaction with Heat Inherit. Here's what I mean. See, Heat Inherit is a very weird mechanic in Warframe where if you inflict a heat status effect on an enemy with a weapon, and then you inflict a heat status effect with an ability afterwards on the same enemy, then the game thinks that the faction damage bonus, the heat damage bonus, as well as the status duration that was modded on the weapon that inflicted the first heat effect, the game thinks that these things are actually now also modded on the ability that inflicted the second heat status effect. That will make the heat status effect from the ability much stronger because that now is being buffed from all the mods that were on the weapon before. And while we personally cannot use any weapons, in my testing it seemed that the clones created through Duplex Bond, when they attack an enemy and deal heat status effects, that this can actually be used as Heat Inherit for the heat effects that you deal with your first ability, making them much stronger. That's why for my companion weapon, I use the Tazakor, which is able to hit multiple enemies at the same time with a arcing beam. This right here would be the Tazakor build, melting away enemy armor with corrosive, while having heat damage as well as faction damage modded onto it. So yeah, long story short, all you personally really need to do with this build is switch on your Roar and start spamming the living heck out of your first ability. Definitely not the craziest or the most meta build, but I personally find it really funny, and it creates a whole lot of carnage on screen. And if you also want to see build guides on all the other reworks that came with this update, plus the new weapons, then you might want to think about maybe leaving the channel a sub to not miss out on them day one. Welcome to the crew. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demonoid Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nos Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Lycon Shepherd, Ondakanio2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, Hockey Hunter, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.